Hello, friends. Welcome to this week's edition of the Patchwork Revival podcast. I am your host, Emily. I'm happy to be here today. This is going to be a solo show where I am going to talk about different ways that I have seen, read, heard about, been wanting to try, and tried myself for finishing a quilt. I hope whether you're a beginner or an experienced quilter, you're going to learn something from this episode. I know that I did. I've kind of gotten into a routine where I finish all my quilts pretty much by myself in a very particular way. And now that we've kind of dived into this a little bit and I've looked into things from a historical perspective and then also sort of some updated things that I found from recent years, I feel like there are so many ways to finish a quilt. And by finish, what I'm going to be talking about is actually sewing or quilting the 3 layers of a quilt sandwich together. So there's also binding that you could argue is part of finishing a quilt or finishing the raw edges. But I feel like that is enough of a technical topic that could be an entirely different episode. So we're actually going to be talking about how you sew the 3 layers of your quilt sandwich together, aka quilt or finish a quilt top so that it is a usable item. Before we get started, a couple housekeeping things. 2025 has been off to a great start. I've been really enjoying the podcast. I'm so glad that I decided to keep going, keep trekking along. I do just want to remind you all that subscribing to the show is amazing. Leaving a review on your platform of choice always helps. I would love it if you would share this with someone. My whole goal in making this podcast is to build connection and community through quilting. So if you have a friend that you think would like this podcast, I hope you'll share it with them. Now we'll dive right into the episode without further ado. And I wanted to start with a quote from the book that I absolutely love and I've shouted out before on this podcast. It is called The Romance of the Patchwork Quilt in America. It is by Carrie Hall and Rose Kretzinger. It's a used copy. I wanted to open with this thought from Carrie Hall as written in The Romance of the Patchwork Quilt in America. This was published in the 1930s. Let me just double check that. Yeah, 1935. Keep that context in mind as I read this. So this is a summary at the very last sort of paragraph of the chapter where she is talking about basically how do you make a quilt? And she outlines picking your pattern, choosing your fabrics, piecing, setting your blocks together. And then we get into this. When you have finished your top, turn it over to an experienced quilter, for a beautiful quilt may be made or marred by the quilting. Most professional quilters charge per spool with an extra charge for marking, also a charge for binding. So, the main reason I wanted to share that with you is because over the years that I have been quilting or talking about quilts, especially in the era of social media, YouTube videos, and things like that, there are always people who feel the need to share commentary that is like, well, why don't you actually learn how to sew and finish your own quilts? Or if you're not hand quilting, you're not making a real quilt. And I just have to point out, first off, what is the point of that kind of commentary? It's to be pretty rude and judgmental, and I just don't buy it. I don't accept it. It's just not one of those things that I'm interested in perpetuating. So I am here to declare that as part of the Patchwork Revival, if you are piecing quilt tops, you are a quilter. If you finish them yourself, you are a quilter. If you send them to a longarmer, you are a quilter. if you don't piece tops, but you long arm quilts or hand quilt quilts, you are a quilter. There is so much that goes into this art. There's just really no reason to be exclusionary or to make people feel less than because of a particular way that they choose to do things, or maybe that they can afford, or maybe that they're physically capable of doing. So I just want to take a minute to start off by saying, however you finish a quilt, however you define a quilt, if you are making a quilt, you are a quilter, and I'm so glad that you're here. So the first thing I want to talk about is sort of the typical way that we think of finishing a quilt, and that is by quilting the quilt by hand. This is historically what was happening with patchwork quilts. First off, the idea of quilting, meaning putting layers of fabric with cotton together and then stitching a running stitch through all of those layers, is ancient. It's been around since like ancient Greece, medieval times, all sorts of things. And then it came over to the American colonies with English and Dutch settlers, is basically what I've read. And again, please remember, I am an amateur historian. I like learning about the history of quilting as best I can. And my cultural context is that I am an American. I grew up here. This is what I know. And so a lot of the literature that I end up looking at is from American sources. So the practice of quilting was brought over to the American colonies by the colonists. And even looking back in garment sewing, a lot of women had quilted petticoats and things like that. And so all of that originally was done by hand because the sewing machine was not around. So quilting all of these quilts by hand is how they were finished. And hand quilting has evolved over time. I feel as though more of the antique quilts that you look at, there was this idea of basically the finer your needlework, the more sought after your handicraft was, and the more revered you were in your community. Hand quilting was a way that women came together. They quilted quilts together. So traditionally, girls would piece quilts as they were growing up, and they would go in their chest, and they would not be quilted until she was basically announcing an engagement. She was engaged to be married. And so at this point, all of her quilt tops came out, and she would announce her engagement by quilting her quilts, having a quilting. It was a thing. It was an event. And a lot of the books that I've read have these really fascinating descriptions of how the quilts were stretched out on this frame. The frame was big, but as they would attach the edges of the quilt, they would have to quilt as far as they could reach in, and then they would roll it up under, and then they would quilt the more parts that they could reach, and then they would roll it up under. So it was kind of a shrinking frame. And that limited the amount of people who could be involved in a quilting because there was only so much room around the frame. And so basically, the finer your stitches were and the more even and beautiful they were, the more likely you were to be invited to a quilting. And I think that's so fascinating and so interesting to think about it. You know, we always make something a status symbol, and quilting was just one of those things. So I have a special place in my heart for hand quilting. My grandmother was exclusively a hand quilter. She did make some t-shirt quilts for, cousins and things like that. And those got sent to a longarmer. I can't imagine trying to hand quilt through like interfacing and all these sorts of things, but She loved hand quilting, and she actually was involved in her local community. They had a group. They called themselves the Quilting Ladies. They were like the church had a group of ladies that would get together and they would quilt. And the way that they quilted is around a frame in this big room. Every month, somebody else would get to put up a quilt. So they rotated through the different members and they would all sit around the quilt and spend the day once a week quilting, like the full day, just quilting this quilt. I actually have a quilt quilted by the Quilting Ladies, hand quilted. And it's such a treasure because when I really look at it, I know the context. And so I know there were many, many hands involved in making this quilt. So when you look at particular blocks, you'll see some of the stitches are so fine. They're so even. Like I'm talking a 16th of an inch. That means there are 16 stitches in 1 inch, or like an eighth of an inch. That's tiny. And then there's some that are like probably 4 stitches to an inch. And it's just one of those things that I feel like quilting in general is something where you can build your skill and by practicing, but you also have this style. And so some people are never going to be these fine 16 stitches to an inch type people. And that's fine because your quilt still gets quilted, but I absolutely love it. They did quilt on a frame. And I will say as well, my grandmother also quilted at home, her home, on a frame. And she would, spend her afternoons on her frame that my uncle actually fixed up for her because she wanted it. And she would stretch her quilts kind of across this frame, and then she would sit and work on them. And I guess she probably just went from one side, rolled it up, all until she got to the other side and was done with quilting. But she did a lot of quilts by herself as well. And, those are floating around in our family. And it's so cool to have that and to know that her hands were touching it. There are many people who still hand quilt that way. And by that way, I mean a small needle, a small thread, like a 50-40 weight thread, sort of just what you would normally use for piecing. And a lot of really traditional hand quilting, I feel like, focuses on having almost invisible stitches, having very even, tiny stitches so that you really don't see the stitches themselves as part of the quilting design. You literally just see a popped texture. And it's really beautiful. It's very masterful. I actually have a project that I have been working on for years at this point that I decided to hand quilt in a similar style, and it's taking me forever, and I haven't worked on it in forever. But it's a really interesting thing when you sit and work on it because I hand quilt. I don't have a lot of space where I can just pop up a frame and leave it like against a wall in a house or in the middle of the living room or something. So I actually hand quilt on my lap, and I quilt in a hoop because my grandmother taught me how to quilt, and the way that you do it through a frame or on a hoop is by basically using your top hand to kind of rock your needle and gather or pick up stitches. And the bottom finger is almost like, that's how you know you've gone through the fabric. You kind of touch your knuckle and you get, or it's almost like the padding of your finger, and you kind of, it's like a weird little rocking motion that's really hard to explain, but you figure it out and you get a touch and you figure out kind of how to do it. And I'm so used to using my top and my bottom hand that I don't really understand how I could do this without a hoop or a frame. And I do know there are so many people who hand quilt just with something on their lap, just a loosey-goosey quilt sandwich. And I find that so fascinating, but I just can't do it because I think I have that like muscle memory. I feel like it's probably accurate to say that today a very popular form or style of hand quilting is using a little bit of a heavier thread. So that would be like a 12 weight thread or like a number 8 pearl cotton thread. I've hand quilted something like that before. So it's with a little bit of a bigger needle because you just have to have a bigger eye, like kind of an embroidery needle type thing. And it's just bigger stitches where you actually see the stitches, and it still makes a gorgeous texture and a textural design. But I feel like the stitches themselves actually become part of the design element. And that is so cool to see. It's almost like a shishiko type look, except rather than doing straight lines or things like that, people do sort of traditional quilting designs like clamshells or things like that. And then some people just do kind of stitch in the ditch and that's it. So that's a little overview of hand quilting. I love hand quilting. I think that it's incredible. It is very relaxing. It takes forever. So, it's one of those things where there's a give and take. Do you want a finished quilt in the next decade? Or would you like to just sit and enjoy yourself slowly hand stitching? Now, I will tell you the way that I finish my quilts is by quilting them on a domestic machine. I'm sitting here with my domestic machine right beside me because I'm in my sewing room. But this is a quilter's machine manufactured by Pfaff. Again, I call it Pfaff because I'm a Texan, and her nickname is Sassa Pfaff. I'm totally not sponsored by Pfaff or Pfaff. I just like the machine. And I've had her for a long time. This machine has a large throat space, but any machine where you can drop the feed dogs, you can free motion quilt. Any machine where you can put a walking foot on with the feed dogs up, you can do like walking foot quilting. And I remember thinking that I would just do this because I didn't really have time to hand quilt something, and I really wanted to finish a quilt. And so I was like, well, I guess I got to quilt it somehow. So I'll just do some straight lines and I'll put it through my machine. So I had Googled how to do this. My first quilt that I ever finished on my domestic machine was just straight line quilting, like 2-inch space straight lines with my walking foot. And I was like, wow, well, that actually went pretty fast. I mean, I finished it in like a couple days instead of like months to years, which is how my previous quilts had been finished by hand. So I kind of got really interested in it, and I started doing a little bit more dense quilting using straight lines. Then I found a book called Walk by Jackie Gehring. It's a very popular book. She also has written Walk 2.0. And that totally opened my eyes to this whole new world of walking foot quilting, because she walks you through in that book how to do different intersecting lines and angles that give you beautiful, complicated secondary designs that basically come together on your quilt top in your finished quilt to look almost like an edge-to-edge pantograph that you would get from sending your quilt to a longarm quilter and having a digitized design done all over the top. So that really opened my eyes and made me personally really enjoy the creativity that can come along with finishing your quilt, aka quilting your quilt on a domestic machine. I also free motion quilt a little bit on my domestic machine, and sometimes it's easier said than done. I've practiced a lot. I know my machine. I like doing that as well. And it's very approachable, I think, for people as long as you're just willing to practice. Basically, if you can drop your feed dogs on your machine, you can free motion quilt on your machine, which is pretty cool. So most of us who quilt have a domestic machine for piecing. And allegedly, most of our machines are capable of quilting a quilt, either with a locking foot or via free motion quilting, depending on your machine's capabilities. I've only ever used my machine. I have had 2 different machines in my lifetime. And so I know that I can do it on my machines, and I feel pretty confident you can do it on your machine as well. So that is something to consider when you have a quilt top to finish. I will say the worst part for me of quilting my own quilts on my domestic machine is basting. Oh my gosh, I can't stand it. And I swear that's why I have a shelf full of whips or works in progress, because they're just sitting around waiting for their glow up because they haven't been basted yet. If I just had someone to baste my quilts, I would have so many quilts finished. I feel like I can confidently say that. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on domestic quilting, meaning quilting a quilt on your domestic machine. Highly encourage you to try it. It's one of those things that I know for a while, and some people think they're going to just ruin their quilt by doing that. But you know what? By the time you finish, if you do everything all over, by the time you wash it and your quilt crinkles and gets soft and cozy, you don't even notice the quilting, let's be honest. So it's totally okay to practice. It's always about progress over perfection, enjoying the process. Something I like to do, so I do it. Other people do not like to quilt on their domestic machine, and they do not want to be hand quilting their quilts. So what's an option for them? Send it to a longarmer, of course. I have never done this. Shockingly, I have never sent a quilt to a longarm quilter. Not really for any particular reason other than I just kind of like finishing my own quilts. And a lot of times when I'm quilting or piecing a quilt, planning a quilt project, I know already in my mind how I want it to be quilted. And I'm like, yeah, I'll just do that. I'll just get it done. So that's just the kind of person and personality I am. Some of the limitations, I think, for longarm quilting is that it does cost money. Longarms are very expensive, like $20,000, $30,000, depending on the brand, the computerization, and those sorts of things, the size. And so while they're incredible, and I really, really, really one day would love to have a longarm, sometimes I am shocked by the amount of people who actually personally have long arms because they're so expensive. But they're so cool because they can do these very, very exact digitized, computerized designs. So you can get some really beautiful designs called pantographs that go from edge to edge. People free motion quilt using a long arm. You can pay to have someone do custom quilting on like a special project that you have. I don't even know how to start estimating what it would cost to have a particular project, either long arm edge to edge with a pantograph or custom quilted, like with free motion quilting. But I would imagine it's relatively expensive. And I'm sure that they typically charge by, the square inch, because I guess that way you can probably estimate how much thread you're going to use, how much time it's going to take up on their long arm machine, that sort of thing. Because a lot of places that have long arms run as a business, or there are individuals who have long arms that run as a business. So they are professional quilters. They know what they're doing. They know how to use this. A good long armor, I would imagine, would sort of talk you through, here's what I would recommend when you're choosing a design or a pantograph for the quilting. If you do a denser design, it's going to look like this versus this and all the things. So I'm a little bit fascinated by long arming, mostly because I've never done it. I'm also a little bit intimidated by it because I feel like, what if I got my quilt back and I was disappointed? Then again, I rarely ever run into anyone who has been like, man, I'm really disappointed with the way this quilting came out. So maybe I'll try it one of these days when I just really need to get something done. I also shared, that I'm pregnant, and I am like 8 months pregnant at this point, which is probably why if I sound out of breath, please just give me a little grace here. But I just basted on the floor, pin basted this like gigantic throw size quilt, and I was crawling around pin basting things, and I was like, this is ridiculous. What am I doing? I think I was secretly hoping to induce labor. It didn't work. So word to the wise, just skip the floor basting unless you have to, especially if you are gravid. So those are some of the ways that you could finish a quilt with the traditional idea of quilting. Another thing that I wanted to talk about is this idea that I have seen over the last several years when I kind of dove back into quilting after my sort of childhood and how much I loved it. So once I got out of probably like residency and stuff, I really was getting more prolific with my quilting because I just had more time to do it. And so I was kind of exploring ways to finish a quilt that were pretty accessible to me because I was on a low budget, low time, didn't have a lot of space and things like that. So I stumbled across at that time this method called quilt as you go. I'm sure some listeners quilt as you go, but essentially the way that I understand it is you would have a quilt block. So like, let's say that you did a throw size quilt and it was 12 blocks, just for example. You would quilt each block individually as like a small quilt sandwich. And I'm sure you could do that by hand if you wanted, or you could do it on your domestic. That would be a much more manageable size than like, a like 10 by 10 block rather than a throw quilt that you're like cramming through your machine. But you would basically quilt all of those quilt blocks individually. And then you go back later and set them together. Now that part, I can't exactly explain, but there's different ways that, there's books, there's YouTube videos, there's tutorials where you can join your blocks together in a way that you would be able to see them, see the joining or the way they were set together. So that has always been a little bit intriguing to me. And I hesitated to include it because it's quilting, but I think it's quilting in a different way that could be an option for people who have limited space, maybe limited physical abilities to be maneuvering and handling a massive quilt, cramming it through a machine, that kind of stuff. And so I just thought that's a really interesting idea. And I wanted to just include it in this episode because I thought it might be something that sparked somebody's interest and maybe made someone think, I can quilt my own quilt, or I want to try to quilt my own quilt, or I want to do this or that. Again, however you finish your quilt, it does not matter. But knowing your options is how you can make an informed decision about what to try. And also, knowing the different things that are out there and your different options, I think really can open up different doors to creative practice and like learning new things and being creative. So the other way that people have probably heard of in the past of finishing a quilt or turning your quilt top into a quilt is by tying the quilt. I have never tied a quilt. We do have some quilts. My husband's granny made him a quilt when he was little, and it's a tied quilt. It's almost like a whole cloth quilt made from a Looney Tunes character fabric, and it's backed with like the super bright yellow. It's like a quilt that, you know, he probably like loved when he was like 7, but it's hand tied with red yarn. And, you know, basically the way you would tie a quilt is similar to quilting it. You have to lay out a quilt sandwich. So you'd put your backing, your batting, your top, layer those together, keep things smooth. And then about every 4 to 5 inches, you know, put a piece of yarn through. It was traditionally done with yarn. And tie your quilt, like tie it in a knot. So basically it was just like incremental areas where the 3 layers are tacked or like tied together. Again, I've never tried to do this. I would imagine it's a much quicker process, but again, I don't know because I've never personally done it. One thing about it to note is that the yarn tails, you know, of the ties are loose and they stick up and they fray and they just kind of hang there. So like my husband's quilt that we still have in our house is tied, and there's probably like little 1-inch tails that are just kind of dangling about, and they're fine. I mean, it was like acrylic yarn. It's held up. No big deal. One really interesting thing that I've been wanting to explore is when I went to one of my quilt club meetings, there was a lady giving a presentation, and I can't remember what she was talking about. Maybe it was for a show and tell where she brought, you know, you can show and tell a project that you finished or a quilt you're working on, but we can also bring a notion or something and show and tell that tool or notion or whatever. And so she actually brought a doll maker's needle. I don't know if you've ever seen one, but they're, you know, 5-6 inches long, maybe 4 inches long. You can get them different sizes. A pretty big gauge, because what they're designed for is basically stitching like eyes or embroidering like on a doll's head or face. So they're designed to be able to stick through a doll to like hide a thread from the front, and you stick it through and pull it through to the back. Almost like an upholstery needle in a way, I guess is probably a way to sort of imagine it. Just Google it real quick if you can, if you're having trouble visualizing this, because I feel like I'm doing a really poor job of explaining it. But she said how she has used that before is loading it with a, you know, appropriate, probably like a 12 weight. I'm picturing like a heavier weight, maybe like a pearl cotton thread or something. Loading it with that, like a pretty long length of it. And then you could run it up, you know, between your layers, pull your knot through your layers. Like meaning in between the backing and the quilt top. So in your batting layer, popping your needle through there, much as you would if you were hand quilting. And then doing a sort of crisscross X like you would if you were tying. But instead of leaving the tails out of the top and tying them and having them loose, you could run them back through after you make your tie. You could just run those tails back through the batting layer about 4 or 5 inches to your next area that you wanted to tie or tack together. And I thought that sounded really cool because for me personally, I don't love those little tails hanging out. And I was like, that would be really neat if you could do little X's or maybe even like a little star design or something, the little 4 or 5 inch spaced grid across your quilt top so that you sort of got a little quilting look without the tied look, because it just doesn't feel as finished to me, and that's just me personally. I've also seen people who left tails with like a nice wool yarn and then like felted the wool, so it was just looked like little tiny adorable like dinky little pom-poms where all those tails were, and that was a really cool design element that I've seen. So again, I'm sharing this with you because I think it's just a really cool way to kind of get some of your creative wheels turning and just sort of recognize how many ways there really are to do something. So all of these methods, tying a quilt, quilting your quilt with a long arm, your domestic, by hand, quilt as you go, you're still going to have rough edges around the edge of your quilt that you're going to have to bind in one way or another. Again, we're not going into binding today. People feel very strongly about that, just as they feel strongly about how you should quilt your projects when you're done. But just know that that's not going to be a totally finished quilt top. Now, one thing I wanted to mention is this concept of birthing a quilt. Have you ever heard of this? I have done this inadvertently before, thinking I was being so creative, but I'll explain what it is. And I'll explain how I came upon this. So I made a little stuffed animal for my daughter. It was a little bunny, and she was very cute, almost like a little doll version of a rabbit. And she had clothes, a little dress, and I had this orphan quilt block that I was like, you know what I should do? I should turn that into a little doll quilt for her little bunny rabbit, and that'll be like her little baby. So I took this block, sewed it right side together with some other fabric, on the back, and I put a piece of batting between it, sewed 3.5 of the edges together, flipped it inside out. And so then I had, a right side. My block was up the right side. My backing was down on the right side out. And I just top stitched all around it to kind of close the hole that I had used to flip it inside out. And then I was like, I wonder if people ever do that with quilts. And then I figured out, yeah, it's actually a technique called birthing a quilt. And I was kind of like, gosh, do people even really do that? Because it seems like it would be really hard to do on like a big quilt. But what I found is that a lot of times people will do that. It's called birthing a quilt. I guess because your whole quilt comes out of one small hole that you leave when you sew, 3 edges together or whatever, and then you invert your quilt so that then it becomes right side up and your edges are all, finished. And a lot of people did this, and then they would tie their quilt, because I feel like it would be really difficult to do that and then run your quilt through, like, say, a domestic machine, for example, without getting massive, like, wrinkles and stuff like that. I suppose you could maybe do that, birth your quilt, and then pin baste it, perhaps. I don't really see how you could spray baste it that way. That would be very ambitious, and I'm not sure that you could get it to work, to be honest, but maybe you could try something like that. But the interesting thing is that right around when I was kind of learning all this, I was like, wow, this is kind of cool. Figuring out that there were other ways that people, were finishing their quilts. My parents were at an antique store, a local store, and they were like, hey, we found this quilt. It's like $25. Do you want us to get it for you? And I was like, I don't even need to see it. I mean, yeah, I would love it. I would love that. So they brought it to me, and I was looking at it, and I realized it wasn't bound. And I was like, oh, wow. Because anyway, 3 of the edges are perfectly together, almost like a little pillow, like finished edges, top stitched about a quarter, maybe 1/8 of an inch to a quarter of an inch around all the edges. And then the 4th edge was basically just like folded under. So, not that I'm judging this maker, but I'm like, she was feeling kind of lazy. She just needed to get this done. I'd imagine it would be really simple to do like kind of a running water stitch to kind of keep the edge hidden, and then top stitch around it. But she just folded it, stitched it, no big deal. But I was like, whoa, cool. This isn't bound. This was a birthed quilt. And then the really interesting thing I found about it is that when you look at it, it's hand quilted. So she birthed it and then hand quilted it. And it looks great. I mean, she didn't use batting in the quilt. So it's a very thin, kind of summery quilt is the way I think about it. It's made of a lot of different fabrics, like polyesters and all these things. So I guess it was probably from, I don't know how to tell, but maybe 60s, 70s, 80s. I don't really know, to be honest. I'm not well-versed in aging textiles or dating textiles, but I thought that was really cool. And again, I feel like that's something that maybe is a little obscure. It's a little bit out there. I don't know how common it is, but I thought it was really fascinating, and it kind of could open the doors for some people. Because let's be honest, sometimes getting our quilts finished is really the most important thing, and that is our goal at the end of the day, because we want our kids to have our quilts. We want to use our own quilts. We want to go have our picnic on our quilts, whatever. The reason we're making quilts is to have fun and to use them and to love them and appreciate them. So I would just encourage you to consider all of these ways that you can finish a quilt. If you know of any other ways, leave a comment. Find me on Instagram at Patchwork Revival Studios. You can leave a comment on the YouTube video. I always check those. You can send me a message on Instagram. I would love to hear about your favorite way to finish a quilt, because I'm always looking for solutions and ideas and stuff to share with people. So I hope this jogged your memory. I hope this made you think about a few things. I hope this episode inspired you to try something new. Again, if you would share this show with a friend, I would love it. I hope that you are enjoying the podcast. And we'll see you next time here at Patchwork Revival. Bye, y'all. Well, that's it for this episode of Patchwork Revival. I loved having you here with me talking all things quilty. Don't forget to subscribe to the show and leave a rave review. Also, be sure to jump down to the show notes to find links for this episode, as well as the link to my shop where you can enjoy 15% off as a podcast listener with code REVIVAL. Remember that the Patchwork Revival podcast is here to celebrate the connection made in the quilts we love. I'll see you next time.